forgot about witness so-and-so, but
No,
I don't think that was the best.
We're good? Okay.
No witnesses.
All right. Thank you, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Savannah Frances Lee Leckie. She was a typical teenage girl with an atypical life, unfortunately, that ultimately led to a horrifying and tragic end that no person, especially no child, should ever have to experience in rural Ozark County between July 18th and July 20th, 2017. I expect this court, Your Honor, will hear that Savannah was born on June 3rd, 2001 to the defendant, Rebecca Ruud. Various witnesses will tell you that Miss Ruud thought she was not fit to be a mother, and that sometime before Savannah's birth, her mom met Tamil Leckie Mate, and a friendship was established between the two. Tamil and her then husband, David Leckie, could not have children on their own. And so Savannah was born, and I expect that you're going to hear that through a long and convoluted process, Tamil and David eventually adopted Savannah as their own child. And they even took in Savannah's half-sister, Michaela. You'll hear about how Savannah lived in Minnesota with David and Tamil until about 2016, the later half of 2016, when she was 15 years old. I expect you'll hear in 2010, David and Tamil separated, as many people do. Many marriages end in divorce and separation, and Savannah, being a typical teenage girl, began to act out. And I expect you'll hear from Tamil and other witnesses that Savannah was on the autism spectrum. And she would also cut herself. And a lot of this occurred, a lot of the cutting occurred because of what was going on in her home life. Eventually, it was decided that Savannah would be better off with her biological mother in Ozark County, the defendant. Tamil and David, they believed they had exhausted all options and worked out an agreement with Savannah and David. David owed child support to Tamil due to the separation, and Tamil would pay a portion of that child support to the defendant. You'll hear that the defendant herself went up to Minnesota, picked up Savannah, and brought her to Ozark County in late 2016. And you'll hear that Tamil and Savannah kept in touch, and Tamil talked to Rebecca. Eventually, something changed, and Savannah was reported missing on July 20th of 2017. Now, how I expect the state will present its case in this, its evidence in this case, will first be a broad overview of the case. The state expects to present the testimony of now former Sheriff Darren Reed. Sheriff Reed will tell you about how he was at a training, I believe in Columbia, Missouri, on July 20th, when he received a phone call about a missing juvenile child, Savannah, in the area of Theodosia. I expect Sheriff Reed, being the chief law enforcement officer for Ozark County, rushed back from Columbia in record time to go to the location where the child was reported missing. That's the defendant's farm in rural Ozark County. Now, Sheriff Reed gets his two most experienced deputies to work on this case, Chief Deputy Winston Collins and Deputy Curtis Dobbs, who are both now with the Christian County Sheriff's Office. I expect Sheriff Reed will give you some background information about this very, very rural part of Ozark County, the property itself, and will tell you about his involvement in the case, where he was present for numerous search warrants executed on the property, which ultimately culminated in the discovery of human remains in a burn pile on August 4th, 2017. And the court's going to see photographs of that burn pile and the process by which it was disassembled. Sheriff Reed will tell you he immediately knew when he got there on July 20th, 2017, that there was no way that Savannah could have left this remote and large piece of property that was in the ruralest parts of this state. Next, I expect you'll learn that before July 20th, there was a fire at defendant's farm that raged out of control on July 18th. You'll hear that the defendant herself was actually a volunteer firefighter, and she knew she was supposed to call sheriff's office if there was a fire like this. But instead, she called everyone but the sheriff's office. She called several members of the various fire departments that she worked with. They were dispatched and they helped put out the fire, and you'll hear from some of those firefighters. Now, I expect you'll hear that some of the firefighters knew Savannah. After all, the defendant was a volunteer firefighter. And they wanted to check on her well-being that day on the 18th. But the defendant would not let them anywhere near the camper trailer on the property where Savannah lived. You'll hear that it was an intensely hot day in July, much like it is now, and that they wanted water, which would have brought them close to the camper trailer. And the defendant refused their request for water and would not let them see Savannah that day. You'll hear that none of the firefighters actually checked Savannah for any injuries that day. The defendant told everyone that Savannah was naked in a sealed-up camper trailer that had no electricity on a sweltering summer's day. You'll hear from Robert Pete Jr., the defendant's then boyfriend and later husband. Pete Jr. was with his father, Pete Sr., on that day when they both responded to the residence. Pete Jr. was one of the persons that received a phone call from the defendant on July 18th. And his dad was a volunteer firefighter, so they headed out to the defendant's residence. Pete Sr. tended to some physical injuries, some burns that the defendant had on that day. And while Pete Jr. helped rake out the fire, snuff out the fire that day, the fire department left. Pete Jr. stayed behind to be with his girlfriend, the defendant. Pete Jr., I expect, will tell you that Savannah was last seen the next day, July 19th, very late into the evening, chasing fireflies on the hill, that it must have been 11 o'clock at night, and that there was an argument between the defendant and Savannah about some homework that had not been done, and that Savannah went to the bed in the camper trailer, and she was never seen again until August 4th, 2017, when what was left of her was discovered in a burn pile. Savannah would be reported missing late the next morning on July 20th. You will hear about the extensive efforts that the Ozark County Sheriff's Office went to find Savannah and the defendant's insistence that she ran away. The search was extensive. Officers from many different agencies, Highway Patrol, the Sheriff's Office, Arkansas, were all there, and civilians and a helicopter and a fixed-wing aircraft were brought in, all to no avail, because the defendant knew where she was all along, in that burn pile that was discovered on August 4th, 2017. You will hear, and how do we know this? You'll hear from the defendant herself, admitting...
Your Honor, we will need to object to where he is beginning to go in his opening statement. He's going to talk about a recording, and we need to, for the record, object to this recording being brought in as that it is
brought in as evidence.
Yes, that it's brought in as evidence, but that it's also that it is we believe it's still protected, and we have to argue that.
Okay.
Obviously, Judge, my response to that is the Missouri State Supreme Court has said otherwise.
Overruled.
Thank you. You'll hear the defendant herself admit to burning Savannah's body.
I will make that a continuing objection, and any time that he references the tape, so we don't have to stop every time. Okay.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor. You'll hear that the defendant herself admits to burning Savannah Lecky's body. So the defendant got a lawyer after many searches were conducted on her property. Now, obviously, everybody has a right to an attorney. There's no disputing that. But for whatever reason, the defendant made a poor decision and brought a recording device with her to the office of the Missouri State Public Defender and recorded her conversation with two members of that office. And you will hear that conversation, that Savannah died as a result of taking drugs, according to the defendant, and that she came across her dead body and burned it. But that's only partially true, Your Honor. That's the defendant's story. What really happened is, I expect on the last day of trial, is we expect to present three separate women that were all housed with the defendant at some point in time during the pendency of this case in the Taney and Ozark County jails. One of these women, Kathy Hilton, has never met the other two women. You'll also hear from Sarah Johnson and Jessica Wallen, who were housed with the defendant in the Ozark County jail. Miss Wallen will tell you that the defendant admitted that she had crushed up pills and put them in a drink, likely Kool-Aid or something similar. Sarah Johnson will tell you about how the defendant told her she wasn't getting money, the child support, and that she was supposed to be getting that money, and that she wasn't going to lose her farm because of some, quote, bratty kid, along with some other unprompted comments about holding someone down in a fire. Finally, you'll hear from Kathy. Kathy Hilton, all of these people are not very good, Your Honor. They're convicted felons. The state admits that. They were in jail for one reason or another. And you'll hear from Kathy that on the night of the 19th, the defendant drugged Savannah with hydrocodone that she had gotten in the days before due to her injuries on her arm. And that the defendant thought she was dead, thought Savannah was dead, and brought her body to the burn pile to dispose of the evidence. And Kathy Hilton will tell you that the defendant admitted to her to throwing Savannah's body in the burn pile. She wasn't dead. She woke up screaming. And that during this screaming, the defendant hit her with a rake or other type of long-handled implement until she could scream no more. And after all of that, all that was left of Savannah was a bag of bones. And after you hear all of the evidence presented in this case, I will ask the court to return a verdict of guilty as to murder in the first degree, as no child should ever have to suffer the same fate as Savannah Francis Lee Leckie. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor.